The battlefield stretched across the broken plains, the sky painted in hues of fire and ash. The remnants of a once thriving human colony smoldered, reduced to ruins by the relentless assault of the Xy'thari Empire. Amidst the wreckage, the last human warrior stood tall, bloodied but unbroken, his blade still dripping with the ichor of slain foes. General Kael Ardyn, a legend among his people, had fought valiantly. His armor, though battered, gleamed under the flickering light of the burning city. His chest rose and fell in heavy breaths as he tightened his grip around his plasma-forged sword. The Xy'thari forces surrounded him, towering, insectoid beings with exoskeletons harder than steel, their multifaceted eyes reflecting the chaos around them. But they did not attack. Instead, they parted, forming a path. From the heart of the enemy ranks, a figure emerged, tall, regal, and otherworldly. Unlike the soldiers, her form was more humanoid, her bioluminescent skin shimmering with an ethereal glow. She wore an ornate battle dress, woven from the strands of living creatures that pulsed with energy. A crown of crystalline spines adorned her head, and her 4 arms moved with a grace both mesmerizing and unnerving. Queen Xy'thara, ruler of the Xy'thari, approached with an expression of curiosity rather than malice. Her voice, though alien, carried the weight of command and the melody of something almost human. "You fight with the fury of 1,000 suns, human," she said, her glowing eyes studying him intently. "Your people are gone, your world burns, and yet, you stand unyielding. Admirable, but futile." Kael clenched his jaw, unwilling to show weakness. He had lost everything, his comrades, his homeland, his reason to continue. And yet, he refused to kneel. He had sworn to defend humanity, to fight until his last breath. "If you wish to end this," he growled, lifting his sword, "then come and finish it." Queen Xy'thara tilted her head, an amused smile gracing her alien lips. "I could," she admitted, "but I have another proposition." Kael narrowed his eyes, muscles coiled like a predator waiting to strike. "You intrigue me, warrior," she continued. "In all my centuries of conquest, I have never seen a human like you. I have crushed worlds, extinguished empires, but never have I encountered such a spirit." She stepped closer, her presence imposing yet oddly captivating. "I will spare your life. More than that, I will end the war. No more bloodshed, no more destruction. I will command my forces to retreat, and your people will have a chance to rebuild." Kael's eyes widened in suspicion. "And in return?" Queen Xy'thara's gaze burned into his, unwavering. "You will become my mate." Silence fell over the battlefield, the weight of her words suffocating. Kael's grip on his sword tightened, his mind racing through the implications. Marriage? To an alien queen? It was absurd. Unthinkable. And yet, the alternative was extinction. "You cannot be serious," he finally said. Queen Xy'thara's expression did not change. "I am always serious." Kael exhaled sharply, his warrior's mind struggling to process the turn of events. He had expected death, not this. "You would end the war for a single human?" he asked, disbelief laced in his voice. "You are not just any human," she replied, stepping even closer. "You are strong, resilient. A perfect match. Our union would solidify peace between our species. It is the only way." Kael looked around. The ruined city, the fallen soldiers, the hopelessness that had gripped his people for years. A future free from war. Was that not what he had fought for? But at what cost? Queen Xy'thara extended a hand, her alien fingers long and elegant. "Choose, warrior. Life and peace. Or death and oblivion." Kael stared at the offered hand, his mind battling against his heart. And then, slowly, he reached out. As Kael's fingers met the queen's, a strange warmth coursed through him. Her skin was unexpectedly soft, smooth like polished stone yet pulsing with energy beneath the surface. A hush fell over the battlefield as the Xy'thari soldiers watched, their luminous eyes flickering with an emotion Kael could not yet name. It was done. He had chosen. Queen Xy'thara's lips curved into a knowing smile. "Wise," she murmured before turning sharply to her warriors. "Stand down." A ripple of movement passed through the Xy'thari ranks as weapons were lowered, the hum of battle fading into eerie silence. Kael barely had time to process the moment before the Queen's fingers tightened around his, and the world around him blurred. In the blink of an eye, they were gone. Kael's vision stabilized, and he found himself standing in a grand chamber unlike anything he had ever seen. Towering crystalline pillars spiraled toward an unseen ceiling, the walls pulsating with veins of bioluminescent light. Strange, floating orbs drifted in the air, casting shifting patterns of color across the floor. The chamber was vast, alien, and yet there was something eerily majestic about it. He turned sharply to face Xy'thara. "What the hell did you just do?" "I transported us to my citadel," she said smoothly, stepping past him toward an ornate throne-like structure. "This is the seat of my rule, where you will learn your place at my side." Kael clenched his fists. "You expect me to just accept this?" Xy'thara turned, her glowing eyes studying him. "You made your choice, warrior. The war is over, and I have upheld my end of the bargain." Kael wanted to argue, to fight, but he knew she was right. Humanity had been on the brink of annihilation. His people were safe now, because of him. And yet, he felt like a prisoner. As if reading his thoughts, Xy'thara approached him again, her movements fluid, almost hypnotic. "You are not a captive, Kael Ardyn. You are my consort, the mate of a queen." Her words sent a shiver through him. He wasn't sure if it was fear, fascination, or something else entirely. "You still have not explained why me," he said carefully. "Of all the humans, why did you choose me?" Xy'thara's expression grew unreadable. "Because you are unlike the others. Your strength, your will, it fascinates me. I have ruled for centuries, watched civilizations crumble, but I have never encountered a spirit as unyielding as yours." Kael's jaw tightened. He did not know if her words were flattery or something more dangerous. Before he could respond, a deep chime resonated through the chamber. Xy'thara turned her head slightly, as if listening to something beyond Kael's senses. "It begins," she said cryptically. "What begins?" She gestured toward a smaller, glowing archway. "Come. There is much for you to see." Kael hesitated, but something in her gaze told him this was not a request. With a deep breath, he followed her through the archway. The corridor beyond pulsed with light, the very walls appearing to breathe. It led to a vast balcony overlooking what could only be described as a city of living architecture. Towering spires twisted into the sky, their surfaces rippling as if organic. Bridges of light connected floating platforms, where beings, some humanoid, others entirely foreign, moved with purpose. The air thrummed with energy, an entire civilization humming with life. "This is the heart of the Xy'thari Empire," Xy'thara said, standing beside him. "A world of endless evolution, where time bends to my will." Kael exhaled, taking in the breathtaking yet deeply alien sight. "You are to become part of this, Kael Ardyn," she continued. "To rule at my side, you must understand what you are now bound to." He turned to her, his voice low. "You may have ended the war, but I do not belong here." Xy'thara's eyes gleamed. "Not yet." There was something in her tone that sent a chill down his spine. He wasn't sure if he had saved his people, or made a deal with something far more dangerous than he could comprehend. And deep down, he wondered, had she truly chosen him? Or had she planned this all along? Kael stood in silence, absorbing the vastness of the alien empire before him. The city pulsed like a living organism, its structures shifting subtly as if they were breathing. It was beautiful in a haunting, otherworldly way. Yet beneath its magnificence, he could feel something else, a presence, a quiet hum in the air, as if the city itself was watching him. "You said I must understand what I am bound to," he said at last, turning to face Xy'thara. "Then tell me, what exactly have I become?" She regarded him with an expression he couldn't decipher. "More than you were before," she said simply. "Less than what you will be." Kael scowled. "That's not an answer." A small, knowing smile touched her lips. "Then let me show you." Before he could protest, she lifted a hand, and the air between them shimmered. A web of light expanded outward, forming a translucent veil of pulsating energy. As Kael gazed into it, the images within the veil moved, scenes of destruction, of battles fought across galaxies, of entire civilizations kneeling before the Xy'thari queen. And then, something else. A vision of himself, clad in armor unlike any he had ever seen, standing beside Xy'thara on a throne of writhing light. The Xy'thari warriors knelt before them, their bioluminescent eyes glowing in reverence. In this vision, Kael was no longer human as he was now. Something in him had changed. His eyes burned with an unnatural luminescence, and his very presence radiated power. Kael took a step back, his breath hitching. "What is this?" "A glimpse of what could be," Xy'thara said. "The fate that awaits you, should you choose to embrace it." His hands curled into fists. "I never agreed to." "You agreed to be mine," she cut in smoothly. "And in doing so, you have become part of something greater than yourself." Kael felt the weight of her words settle on him like an unseen force. He had fought to save humanity, to put an end to war. But was this the price? To become something he no longer recognized? "I will never be like you," he said through gritted teeth. Xy'thara's expression remained unreadable. "We shall see." The following days passed in a blur of rituals, ceremonies, and whispered conversations in a language Kael had yet to fully understand. He was dressed in flowing robes woven from threads of liquid light, and the Xy'thari attendants watched him with something between curiosity and reverence. At times, he could feel their thoughts brushing against his faint, fleeting impressions, emotions rather than words. It was disorienting, and he found himself retreating to the solitude of his chambers, struggling to hold onto his own sense of self. He wasn't sure how much time had passed when Xy'thara summoned him again. The chamber she led him to this time was different. Darker. The walls, once pulsing with light, now twisted with shifting patterns of deep indigo and violet. The air was heavy, thick with an energy that made his skin prickle. At the center of the room stood a structure, part altar, part living entity. It pulsed with a slow, rhythmic glow, and Kael felt an undeniable pull toward it. Xy'thara stepped beside him. "Do you feel it?" Kael swallowed hard. "What is it?" "A bridge," she said, "between what you were and what you will become." He shook his head. "I told you, I will not change. I am human." Xy'thara turned to him then, and for the first time, there was something in her expression that was almost gentle. "Then tell me, Kael Ardyn, what does it mean to be human?" The question caught him off guard. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. What did it mean? His people had been at war for so long, survival had become their only definition of existence. But was that all humanity was? A species that fought and endured? He hesitated. We feel. We choose our own path. We are not controlled by fate or rulers who decide for us. Xy'thara tilted her head. And yet, you chose to be here. To save your people, you made a decision that altered your fate. Was that not human? Kael frowned, hating how easily she twisted his words. I chose survival, he said. Not transformation. Xy'thara smiled. Survival is the first step to evolution. Before he could argue, she extended a hand toward the pulsing altar. If you truly wish to understand, then step forward. Kael hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to refuse, to turn away. But deep down, beneath the fear, beneath the resistance, there was something else. A spark of curiosity. Slowly, he stepped forward. The altar flared to life, and in an instant, his world was consumed by light. Pain. It struck Kael like 1,000 blades piercing every nerve in his body. His vision exploded in white-hot agony as energy surged through him, seeping into his bones, his blood, his very essence. It was unlike anything he had ever felt, not a wound, not exhaustion, but something deeper. Something rewriting him from the inside out. He tried to scream, but no sound left his lips. Flashes of memory, his past, his victories, his losses, rippled through his mind, colliding with something new. Visions not his own. Memories of the Xy'thari, stretching back eons. The birth of stars. The fall of civilizations. He saw them as conquerors, as rulers, but also as something else. As seekers. Evolving, endlessly changing, never stagnant. A single thought whispered through him, not in his own voice. Change or perish. Kael gasped as the vision shattered. The pain receded, and he collapsed to his knees, his breath ragged. The world around him slowly came into focus. The chamber, the altar, and Xy'thara standing before him, watching intently. His hands trembled as he looked down at them. For a terrifying moment, he expected to see something alien. Claws, light-infused veins, shifting patterns of bioluminescence. But no. He still looked the same. Yet, something was different. He could feel it. "What did you do to me?" His voice was hoarse. Xy'thara crouched before him, her glowing gaze locked onto his. "I have given you a glimpse," she murmured. "A mere touch of what lies ahead. Your body has not changed. But your mind." She smiled. "It has begun to open." Kael clenched his fists, his heart pounding. He felt aware. Too aware. The air around him carried whispers he had never noticed before, the pulse of energy in the walls, the silent hum of the Empire itself. "You manipulated me," he hissed. "I awakened you." Kael forced himself to his feet, stepping back from her. This was never about peace, was it? This was never about stopping the war. Xy'thara rose gracefully, her expression unreadable. "The war is over. Humanity will survive." But that was only the beginning. He shook his head. "No. I won't become your pawn. I won't become one of you." Xy'thara regarded him in silence for a long moment. Then, to his surprise, she laughed softly. "You misunderstand, Kael Ardyn. I do not need to force you. The choice is yours, as it has always been." She took a slow step closer, and despite himself, he did not move away. "You fear losing yourself," she said, voice softer now. "That is understandable. But tell me, warrior, have you truly lost anything? Or have you simply seen the world beyond the limits of what you once knew?" Kael exhaled sharply. "I don't trust you." "You do not have to," she said. "You only have to decide what comes next." And that was the most dangerous thing of all. Because, for the first time since he had stepped onto this alien world, he did not know what he wanted. Days passed. Kael withdrew into himself, speaking little, watching everything. The whispers in his mind had not faded. If anything, they had grown stronger. At times, when he let himself relax, just for a moment, he could sense things beyond the physical. The emotions of the Xy'thari around him. The energy coursing through the living structures of their empire. And worse, he found himself drawn to it. He hated it. Hated the way it fascinated him. Hated that part of him wanted to understand. Xy'thara did not press him. She watched, waiting, as if she knew this was inevitable. And maybe it was. One evening, as the twin moons of the Xy'thari homeworld cast silver light over the grand balcony of the citadel, Kael found himself standing beside her once more. "You haven't demanded anything of me since that day," he said at last. Xy'thara sipped from a delicate, translucent chalice, the liquid inside glowing faintly. "Should I?" He studied her. "You want me to choose this willingly. I have already conquered 1,000 worlds by force," she murmured. "Do you think I have not learned the value of a willing heart?" Kael exhaled slowly. "You think I will come to love you?" Xy'thara turned to face him fully, and for the first time, there was something raw in her expression. "Would it be so terrible?" she asked quietly. Kael swallowed. He did not answer. Because, in that moment, he wasn't sure he knew. Kael did not sleep that night. Even as the moon set and the sky above the Xy'thari capital darkened to an abyss of shimmering stars, his mind churned with unrest. He had been trained to fight, to resist, to endure. But this was something else. He had fought wars on 100 battlefields, but this was the first time he was battling himself. And the worst part? He didn't know if he was winning. He stood on the balcony, hands braced against the cold, smooth railing, watching the living city pulse beneath him. It felt like it was breathing, like the very world was alive. And somehow, it felt like it was waiting for him. A quiet rustle of fabric behind him. He knew who it was before she spoke. "You have not yet embraced what is offered to you." Xy'thara's voice was calm, smooth as flowing water. Kael didn't turn to face her. "And yet you seem very sure that I will." "I am patient," she said. "The Xy'thari do not measure time as you do. You will come to understand that." A flicker of irritation sparked in him. "You talk as if my fate is already written." She stepped closer, stopping just behind him. "Is it not?" Kael turned sharply, eyes burning. "No. I choose my fate. That is what it means to be human." Xy'thara studied him for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. "Then choose." Silence stretched between them. "You could leave," she said, gesturing beyond the balcony to the sky. "I have given the order. No harm will come to you. I will not force you to stay." Kael stiffened. "What? You heard me." She stepped past him, looking out over the city. "A ship has been prepared. It can take you back to what remains of your people. You are free, Kael Ardyn." Kael searched her face, looking for a trick, a deception. But her expression remained unreadable. No threats. No ultimatums. Just a choice. The thing he had wanted all along. And yet, a strange feeling coiled in his chest. A weight. The idea of leaving, of stepping onto that ship and never seeing this world again, should have filled him with relief. It should have been easy. Then why did he feel like something was pulling him back? "Why?" he asked finally. Xy'thara tilted her head. "Why am I letting you go?" He nodded. She turned fully to him then, her luminous eyes unreadable. "Because I meant what I said. I want you by my side, Kael Ardyn. But not as a prisoner. Not as something conquered." Her voice softened. "I want you to choose this." Kael swallowed hard. She stepped closer, so close that he could see the faint, shifting glow beneath her skin. "If you walk away now, you will never hear my voice again. Never see this world again. You will return to the ruins of your people, to a life of rebuilding, of trying to find purpose in a world that has already changed." A pause. "Or you can stay." Kael's pulse thundered in his ears. For the first time in his life, the battlefield was gone. No enemy to fight. No orders to follow. No mission. Only a choice. His choice. His throat was dry when he finally spoke. "If I stay, I won't be human anymore, will I?" Xy'thara lifted a hand, hovering it just inches from his chest. Not touching. Just close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her. "You will be more," she whispered. Kael exhaled sharply. He turned away, looking at the sky, at the waiting ship. At the future he had fought for. And at the one standing right in front of him. His fingers curled into fists. His breath came shallow. And then, slowly, he turned back to her. Xy'thara's lips parted slightly, but she did not move. Did not push him. Kael lifted a hand. And for the first time, he was the one to reach for her. His fingers brushed against hers, and in that moment, something clicked into place. A connection. A decision. His choice. The ship would leave without him. Kael Ardyn would not. Kael's fingers brushed against Xy'thara's, and in that instant, the universe shifted. It was subtle. No great tremor, no flash of light, but something deep within him acknowledged the moment for what it was. A point of no return. The waiting ship in the sky no longer mattered. The ruins of humanity, the endless war, the blood-stained memories, none of it carried the same weight it once did. His fate was here. Xy'thara studied him, as if gauging the certainty of his decision. For the first time, she did not speak. She simply waited. Kael inhaled, steadying himself. What happens now? A slow smile touched her lips. Now, You begin. The rituals began at dawn. Kael had expected something violent, a trial of strength, a test of endurance, some physical challenge to prove himself worthy. But the Xy'thari were not human, and their ways did not adhere to the logic of warriors. Instead, the process was slow. Unnervingly so. He was led to a chamber deeper within the citadel, where the walls did not pulse with light as the others did. Here, the energy was calmer, smoother, as if the city itself understood the gravity of the moment. Xy'thara stood at the center of the room, her hands lifted toward a massive, floating sphere of liquid crystal. It pulsed in sync with something unseen, as if alive. "This is the heart of the Nexus," she said, her voice softer than before. "It binds us. It connects every Xy'thari to the greater whole." Kael frowned. "Are you saying you're all linked?" "In a way," she admitted. "We are individuals, but we are never alone. The Nexus allows us to share knowledge, to evolve together. It is why we have never stagnated, never fractured." He exhaled, staring at the shifting surface of the sphere. "And you want me to, what?" "Connect to it." Xy'thara turned to him fully. "I want you to step into what you have already begun." Kael hesitated. He could still walk away. This was the final threshold. But his heart was already beating in sync with something unseen. Slowly, he stepped forward. The moment his fingers touched the surface of the Nexus, reality unraveled. Kael was falling. Not through space, not through air, but through thought, through memory, through something vast and endless. He saw flashes of the past, not just his own, but others. Beings long dead. Ancient Xy'thari rulers, their minds linked through centuries, their knowledge bleeding into one another. He felt time stretch and contract, folding over itself in ways his human mind had never before perceived. He saw himself, Kael Ardyn, the warrior, the last defender of humanity. And then he saw something else. Kael Ardyn, reborn. He gasped, suddenly aware of himself again, his hands pressed against the Nexus. His heart pounded, his skin tingling with unseen energy. But he was still standing. Still himself. Yet, something had changed. He turned to Xy'thara, and for the first time, he could feel her presence not just with his senses, but beyond them. She was watching him, her expression unreadable. "You are not what you were before." Kael touched his own chest. He still felt human. His skin bore no luminous glow, his hands were still calloused and scarred from war. And yet, for the first time, he could hear it. The hum of the Xy'thari. The unspoken language that had been around him since the moment he arrived. He had not just stepped into the Empire. He was now a part of it. The transformation was not immediate. Days passed, and Kael felt himself adjusting, recalibrating. His thoughts no longer felt entirely his own, yet they did not feel stolen either. The connection to the Nexus was not invasive, not suffocating, it was merely present. A quiet pulse in the back of his mind, a whisper of knowledge that had always been there, waiting for him to hear it. He was still Kael. But he was more. And Xy'thara watched him every step of the way. One evening, as they stood once more on the balcony of the citadel, he turned to her with something unreadable in his gaze. "You knew this would happen." "I suspected," she admitted. "You've been preparing me from the moment I arrived." "Yes." Kael exhaled slowly. "I should be angry. And are you?" He thought about it. About everything he had been through. About the war, the death, the sacrifices he had made. And he realized he did not feel anger. He felt something terrifyingly close to belonging. "You changed me," he murmured. Xy'thara shook her head. "No, Kael Ardyn. You changed yourself." Kael turned to face her fully. For the first time, he truly saw her, not as an enemy, not as a conqueror, but as something else entirely. Not an obstacle, but a mirror. A choice he had made. His future. Xy'thara lifted a hand, palm facing upward. Kael looked at it. And this time, he did not hesitate. He took it. Time passed, though Kael no longer measured it as he once did. Days, weeks, perhaps months. It no longer mattered. The Xy'thari did not perceive time as humans did. It ebbed and flowed, a river rather than a rigid structure, and Kael found himself drifting along its currents. He was no longer an outsider. He was no longer merely human. The change had begun subtly. At first, it was the whispers, the silent hum of the Nexus growing clearer, its knowledge accessible in ways he could not explain. Then it was his senses, the way he could feel the pulse of the city beneath his feet, the way he could anticipate movements before they happened, as though he existed a fraction of a second ahead of time. But the greatest shift was in his mind. The longer he remained, the more he understood. The Xy'thari had never sought war for the sake of conquest. They had not destroyed to dominate. They had expanded because it was their nature, because to remain still was to stagnate, and to stagnate was to die. Their existence was built upon evolution. And Kael, he was evolving. The final test came without warning. One evening, as Kael stood in the grand chamber of the Nexus, Xy'thara approached him with an expression unlike any she had worn before. "You are ready," she said. Kael turned to face her. "For what?" She gestured toward the altar, the same one he had first touched, the one that had unlocked something within him. "The last step. You have walked the path, but you have not yet claimed your place." Kael exhaled, steadying himself. "And if I refuse?" Xy'thara tilted her head. "Then you remain as you are. No longer fully human, but not fully one of us. You will be caught between worlds, a man unanchored." Kael frowned. "Would you accept that?" "If it is your choice," she said simply. That was the thing about her. She had never forced him. Not truly. She had only opened the door. Kael looked at the altar, at his past, at his future. And then, with steady steps, he moved forward. The moment his hands touched the Nexus, the final transformation began. This time, there was no pain. No forceful rewrite of his being. Instead, it was a revelation. His mind expanded. He felt the presence of the Xy'thari in its entirety. Not just the city, not just the empire, but the vast network of minds that stretched across galaxies. He could feel them, hear them, understand them in ways he had never before imagined. He was not losing himself. He was becoming something greater. When he opened his eyes, he saw Xy'thara watching him with quiet intensity. "You have chosen," she murmured. Kael looked down at his hands. They still appeared the same, no glowing veins, no altered form. But he knew. He could feel the difference. He was not just Kael Ardyn, the human warrior. He was Kael Ardyn, consort of the Xy'thari queen. A bridge between two species. A new beginning. He turned to Xy'thara, and for the first time, when he reached for her, he did not do so out of obligation, or out of duty. He did so because he wanted to. And when she took his hand, her fingers entwining with his, he understood the truth he had been afraid to face. He had not been forced into this. He had chosen it. And it was not the end of who he was. It was only the beginning. Across the stars, the war faded into memory. Humanity did not perish, nor were they subjugated. Instead, they found themselves standing on the precipice of something new, an alliance unlike any the universe had seen before. And at the center of it stood two figures. A human warrior who had become more, and an alien queen who had dared to love. Together, they would forge a future beyond war, beyond conquest, beyond fear. And in its place, something new would rise. The end.